Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next session, Seamless Integration of Web Components and UI5, in which you'll get a deep dive into the advancements and developments since last year's UI5 Con. We're fortunate to have two experts leading this session, Johannes Gluck, a seasoned UI5 framework development with over 5 years of dedicated experience. And we also have Thorsten Hochreuter, a software engineer in SAP UI5's core team who works on all the foundational elements of UI5. Please help me in welcoming them.
So, hello everybody, and welcome on board for our session and our journey through the seamless integration of web components in UI5. As already mentioned, my name is Johannes, that's Thorsten, and that's our schedule for today. So we start with a short overview. So what are web components, what are UI5 controls, just a comparison as a starter, and then have a look into how to integrate the seamless web components into UI5, or how to integrate them seamlessly into UI5. We'll show a short demo example, coding example, how to consume them within apps and libraries, and then we make a short stop at the beach and take a deep dive into the technical concepts, and at the end an outlook, where are we, what are our plans with the web components, and what you can expect in the future. So, first of all, web components versus UI5 controls. I would say most of you, or probably all of you, know UI5 controls. I guess also a lot of you already know web components, but not sure, are here any people who have no experience or not so many experience with web components? Please raise your hands. Few hands, okay. So then maybe, so as a rough overview, what are web components? As the name already states, it's a component, it is kind of modular, it's closed, it has its inner parts, it's captured within the shadow DOM, for example. You can add them via custom HTML text directly to the DOM, so that's your main facade you have in the end. They are browser native, and I guess one of the most important parts are they are framework agnostic. Whereas UI5 control is also part of the name. They belong to the UI5 framework, and they also rely kind of on the UI5 framework. So therefore you have this framework specific part. But on the other side, it's also nice you have this high level programming model, and moreover, it's important you have the full enterprise support. So you have things like data binding, localization, internationalization, you have theming, and all these things. So that's just to get a rough idea what's the difference between both of us. Therefore, we have the question, why to use web components? So I guess one of the big benefits without framework, they are lightweight. They are standardized, they are commonly used, so you can find web components, I guess, everywhere, and from different programmers, from different providers in the end. They have the full browser support, and especially they are also native. And what's also really interesting and important, they are compatible with the most HTML frameworks. So you can use your web components within Angular, within React, within Vue, and that makes them highly attractive, I would say. So, but there's also kind of a bit of a lack, and that's maybe the point for the next question. Why should we use UI5 web components, or what's the difference for them? What's the key differentiator they offer? And here you have, especially I would say, the best of both worlds. You have on the one side the web components part, they are framework agnostic, but they also bring the things like this enterprise readiness, as mentioned for UI5 controls. You get accessibility features, you get the theming from the Fiori design system, you have the full classic UI5 integration, and also the other stuff like localization, data binding, so all what UI5 makes nice and makes good to use, especially in the enterprise context. So, therefore, we now try to go the road to integrate them into UI5 more and more, not only the UI5 web components, but web components at all, but especially the UI5 web components. And our goal was always to make them first-class citizens of UI5. So what you see here is kind of an comparison between both, or what have UI5 controls as metadata, for example, and what have web components. And as you can see, there is pretty much which is already common. So web components have properties. You have a disabled property, for example. You have a text property. You have other properties. In UI5, within the metadata, you also declare your properties, like a text property or a busy property or something else. You have events, also from the naming the same in the end. And there are only a few differences, but in the end it's a common concept. Slots, for example, you know it from UI5 as aggregations. And for web components, it's just named slots, but it's the same concept behind. You can aggregate other controls or HTML elements within. And you can see there are a few question marks. And these question marks, there is no direct concept in the other world, but maybe we can find something to map them. And we had a look at this. And for example, web components know such things like read-only properties. So if you think about UI5, you define a property in your metadata, and you always get a get and a set for this property. So you have a get text, you have a set text. In web components, there is a possibility to also define them that there should only be a get, or in the end there is no get. You can access directly the property, but you can't write to them. And therefore we thought, for sure, it's nothing easier than just have a getter and let the setter wait for it, and then you have the same thing in the end. And for methods, it's quite the same. You can't define methods in the UI5 metadata, but we can offer methods at the prototype of a control instance, for example. So these are easy things we could map in this direction. And on the other side, we have even in UI5 some things which the web components don't offer this specifically, so associations. And if you think about what are associations in UI5, association usually, let's take an example, the dialog, can have an association to its opener. So it's just a reference to another control. For example, you have a button, you click on the button opens the dialog, and the dialog should appear close to this button. So how does it know which button it belongs to? It's by its association and by its reference. And in the web components, we have similar properties which don't have a specific metadata in this case, but they accept controls or strings, for example, which in the end are quite the same. They provide a reference to the other control. It's the same for the accessibility things like ARIA labeled by or label for. These are also associations, and web components also offer them, and they provide in the end just an HTML element or a string which you can refer to. Maybe a short example how it looks like. So it's only a small coding example, and then I don't want to go too deep into it for now. But you can see on the one part, there is an example how the consumption of a web component looks like. And it's easy to use. Maybe a bit ugly, you have to retrieve the control itself and then add the event listener. From the UI5 world, you know such, I would say, semantical sugar that you can define an press listener within your XML and can just reference to the implementation of the callback within your controller. So that's maybe a bit the difference you have in the consumption. And that's what we want to reach in the end, that the usage of such a button feels quite the same as you would do it for UI5 control. So when you develop, you shouldn't feel any difference whether you have a UI5 control or a web component at hand. But I would say that's enough for now from the theoretical part. Just one mention, that's the documentation of the web components in the demo kit. And before we go more into technical details of it, I would say we have a live demo, and Torsten will show you how to use them.
So, does the microphone work? Yeah, seems so. All right, hi again. Also from my side, I'm Torsten. I will be showing you a couple of interesting things in the code editor. So let's see if it shows up. Well, should be now. Okay. So when I plugged my laptop in, I already pressed enter because I prepared a little bit. This takes some time because we are installing NPM packages, so I saved a bit of time here, but I show you what I did. This is essentially the same thing that you saw this morning in Peter's keynote, because Peter kind of told you the rough idea of what we're showing here today already, like in 5 minutes, and then we're doing this in 20 minutes. So if you want to consume web components, UI5 web components specifically, in your UI5 project, an existing project, you have to do two things. The first one is the first line you see here in my command line. It's this one, highlighted. So this installs the UI5 tooling modules, tooling extension that Peter showed you this morning in the keynote. And then, as Peter mentioned, there is an RTA switch at the end, which automatically configures your project. There are a couple of things that have to happen here. I already opened the YAML file. And you can see on the green lines, that's the diff in this Git repository, you can see what this command changed. So it installed the NPM package, but it also added 2 entries. One is up here in the builder section. That is a custom build task. This is used to actually build your project in the end, and then when you use your 5 web components, you will also find them in the dist folder in the build result. Down here, you will see a middleware. This middleware is running in the development server. So when you do your regular UI5 serve command, this middleware is also running, and that means in the background, on the fly, we will create control wrappers for the web components you use. That means on the lowest level, you will use UI5 web components inside the DOM natively, but one layer on top in your UI5 application, you're dealing with UI5 controls. And this is also what Peter means when he says this is seamlessly. Sorry?
Zoom a bit.
I need to zoom, okay, not a problem. I can zoom in. All right, so hope you can see better. By the way, if you have questions, just ask them directly. I'm not sure if you have a lot of time in the end to do a Q&A, so yeah, I think we're both fine if you just raise your hand and I will try to answer it directly. So as I said, this is the first part that you have to do. This is done by the install command, but there's something else that you might, again, have seen today in the keynote. We need to do a little bit of a configuration to enable TypeScript support. By default, this is not active because we generate DTS files in the background for the web components you use, but with the switch active, it's always generated. But of course, if you have a JavaScript project, you don't need that. So let's copy this configuration quickly for the build task, and then we also copy it down here to the middleware. All right. So this is the configuration in the YAML file. Right now you have installed the tooling extension. Now the second thing you need is obviously web components, right? So you need to install the web components you want to use. This is also very simple. You do something like npm install add ui5/web components. Right? There are different packages that you can use, but we are just using the main package for today because it's the bread and butter controls, input fields, buttons, etc. That's all in there. All right. So, and with this, essentially your project is already set up to consume those web components. So let me show you how this looks like. We don't need the YAML file anymore, and we don't need this anymore. So let's open a view. This is an empty view. There's nothing in here, but I already have a couple of lines commented out here to make it a bit easier for me. So let's comment in the first line. This is essentially just an input field. I mean, you can see this. There is a namespace called WebC. That's an arbitrary name. You can choose that. You have to define it up here in the same list where you also define all other XML namespaces, just like you would define for any UI5 library you're consuming. But there's a little bit of a difference, because since you're not using the UI5 library, but an NPM package, you don't have this dot separated syntax here. You have to use the NPM package name. And In this case, I'm also adding dist because this is the distribution folder in which the web components are stored. You can find that in the documentation. So if you look in the documentation of the UI5 web components, you see the import statements that you can also later use in the controller code. But here it has to be dist. You can leave it away. You don't need to specify it, but I think it's best practice to do so. So, and now we have declared this webc namespace, and now we can use the web components from that namespace as if they were somehow a UI5 library, which they aren't, because they're dynamically generated UI5 controls. So now we have an input field here. I gave it an ID, and there's a value. Let's say hello UI5con smiley face. Then we save this, and now all you have to do essentially is to start your web server. So then let me open the app. Here, you can also zoom in a bit. There should not be too much to see for the moment. All right, so first web components. Pretty simple, it's just an input field, or input field. There's only a text in here, you can type in it and it doesn't change anything. So to show you a bit about the TypeScript support that we have delivered with the current version of the UI5 tooling modules, we're going to build a little bit of a smaller, kind of like a to-do application in the view and in the controller. We're not going into too much detail. We're not going to make it look super nice, but just as an example how this feels if you're writing code. So let me show you something else. If you're interested in a TypeScript support, specifically how that looks like, there will be an auto-generated folder, UI5 tooling modules, and inside there's a types folder, and that's full of generated DTS files. So if you're interested how all of this is stitched together, you can look at this. And if you find bugs, of course, you can open the GitHub issue in the UI5 ecosystem where the UI5 tooling modules lives. So this just as a side note. I'm not going to go into too much detail. We're talking about 50,000 lines of TypeScript code that are generated, so that's a bit too much for today. Maybe for any day. Okay, so we have a TypeScript controller here. It's the controller for our main view. Now let's include another web component. In this case, it's a basic list control. Like with any UI5 control, inside this list control, you can aggregate other controls. In this case, I've chosen the list item standard because it's, well, the standard list item, I guess. It has a text, it has a description, and that's it. And I gave the list an ID. So now, if you go to the application, the live reload already loaded the page, and you can see now here's our list. Now, what would happen if I would press enter here? Right now, nothing happens, so how do I connect this? And I'm going to show you how to do this. It feels like any other UI5 control. The input field has a change event. So you can go to your view, define a change event, and then you can do something like new to do. That's a function that we're now implementing in the controller. Copy this. And I just go to the controller code, put in my name. Event handlers are by default void functions in UI5, so that's why I typed this. And now this function will be called when you press enter or tab in your input field. Now, how do I get the code or the text that I've written in my input field into the list? It's very simple. Any event has an event parameter, and that is a basic UI5 event, but we have specific types to show you what this event has. So the customary naming convention, that's the word I was looking for, is always the control name, $, then the event name. In this case, it's change event. You can see there is already an older version from the SAP UI5 main library, which is deprecated. The first one up here isn't deprecated, because that's the one that we are now using directly out of the native package. So, and now you can see that we have a perfectly typed event parameter. On this event parameter, you can do things like call get source, for example. Let me make this a bit slower. You can see that in this pop-up, it already says input. So now the get source function is correctly typed, and it will return the input field that this event originates from. So let me do this like so. And then on this input field, since this is now a regular UI5 control, you see that it has a getValue function, which returns a string. And that is just the content that I have typed in my input field. Let's call it v for value. And now we want to add this as a new entry in our to-do list. So again, basic UI5 APIs, we're calling by ID. That is the function on the controller to retrieve an element from the view. maybe I can put this side by side so you can see it together with the view. So the list is called to-do list. I'm by ID retrieving the to-do list. Since this is a generic getter, we don't know what kind of control is associated to this ID at runtime. So what you would have to do in TypeScript is you have to cast it into the list control you're expecting, and then on this you will find the functions that are generated in our TypeScript definitions. So in this case, we can add an item, and you can see the typing of this API is that you either have to pass a list item base or a list item group. Luckily, the list item standard implements the corresponding interface behind the list item base, so we can actually just go ahead and create our list item standard here. And give it a couple of constructor parameters. The text property, as we've seen on the left side here, is then just our value that we got from the input field. And we can add another description, which is something like, let's say, hi, how are you? I don't know. Doesn't really matter. Random text. So finally, I think we should also go ahead and clear the input field, just so it's empty again. Save it, and when I go back to my application, probably live reload already worked. My first to-do, and when I press enter, I type the same title. It's probably not that smart. Second title, and you can see now we're adding it. So what we're doing right now is we are manipulating an aggregation, we're getting information from an event, and we're stitching this all together. And the thing that now works for the first time, and that's what Peter teased in the keynote, is that this is now fully TypeScript supported. Before you had to do this in JavaScript, and then you didn't know what event parameters are available, what can I use, etc. And now you have a full code completion that just essentially does all of this for you. So let me quickly show you something else that I find pretty cool. This is the official documentation of the web components. Yeah.
What would be the benefit of the web component input control over the regular input control if you already include the sap library?
Not a lot. So if you already are using a big chunk of the SAP controls, like loading another library or another package of controls would be like a big overhead. So ideally, you stick to the ones that you're using. But if you're building an application from scratch, I would only build it with web components.
And are the web components already ready for example, flex controls, etc., or overall layout controls to use them?
As far as I'm aware, there is no layout controls yet. But maybe there is another session for the web components later on where you can ask that question. But as far as I'm aware, there is no layout controls. This is the reason why I'm using layout controls here. But you could also just use HTML and the XML view in this case, and then do your layouting like you would in the samples that you see on the web components playground.
As I understood it, the advantage of web components is that you get full TypeScript support for the events, which was not there with UI5.
I think it is there. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe the SAP library also has full TypeScript support, including the events.
I'm looking for it all the time.
Okay.
I haven't found it yet.
Maybe I'm wrong. At the very least, the TypeScript, it's there. Okay, so yeah, maybe maybe you have to check this, but I think it should work for the regular OpenUI5 libraries too. Yeah.
As far as I know, you need to import the types or install the types as a dependency, but then it should work.
Okay, so then let me quickly show you something else, which I find kind of cool, because I just recently learned this. This is how I work with these web components when I build smaller applications just based on the UI5 core and web components. I always look in the official documentation. In this case, I've chosen the list control. I recently found out it has a selection mode. So this is a property that has a couple of different values, and I think the delete one is interesting. So if I go ahead and selection mode, just use the one from documentation here, and I save it. Go back to my application. You can see that there's now a little button, a delete button. And when I click it, nothing happens. But again, if you look at the documentation, you can see that there is another event called item delete. And this is something that I wanted to mention here. The UI5 event names, they are camel-cased. Right? What you see here in the official documentation, it has a dash. It's item dash delete. That's how you write it down in the DOM level. But on the UI5 level, you have to camel-case it. So to showcase this, it would then look something like this, item delete. And you could do something like delete delete item. And if you implement this real quick, you can also save the view. So again, here now we have a different event. This time the event comes from the list. So I start this list, $, and then I can look for the delete event. All right, there it is. And now if I, on this event function, call the getParameters API, you can see that it proposes to use an sName, which is the argument for the getParameters, and it only has one value, which is item. And this is correct, because if you look at the original documentation, you can see that in the parameters list, it only has one parameter. And that parameter is called item. And that's the same one that you will find now on the UI5 level of things. So when you do this, you can retrieve your item again. And yeah, so I'm looking at the time. Am I good in time? Should I move on, or? Okay. So, well then, I think we skipped this part because we answered a couple of questions in between. What I would have shown you here is essentially you can now manipulate this aggregation again. You can delete the item from it, and everything you see in your editor, in your controller, is essentially the full API range that any UI5 control offers. And that is the stuff that you don't have on the native level of a web component. That only comes with the UI5 framework level. So yeah, I think then we move on to the next topic. By the way, don't worry, you can ask questions. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, so just one moment until the slides are on again. Yes. So next up, technical concepts, deep dive. Yeah, Thorsten showed you already how it works and how it feels to use it with the TypeScript especially. And what I mentioned already in the beginning is that we need some glue code in between. So on the one side, we have the web components, but it should not feel that you use a different technology. So especially if you use M controls or other controls together with web components, it would be kind of weird if you have on the one side already to remember, now I have a web component at hand and I now need to, for example, web components define her enabled property. It's named disabled. So you don't want to remember, I now have this control there, I need to set disabled, and the other case I need to set enabled. So that it feels like really first-class citizens, it feels like really you have a UI5 control at hand. And so there we have the way on the one side from the UI5 components to the UI5 controls, the full UI5 control, we have this control wrapper in between. And this is not so much code, actually. We have 3 classes. These classes are located in the core library under the namespace sap.ui.core.webc. And there we have this web component base class, I would say. We have the web component metadata and the renderer. And the base class for itself, that's actually, it extends the sap.ui core control. So you have the classical inheritance chain, so that it also behaves like a control, which has the total chain up to the element, managed object, etc. So you have there also the metadata, the properties we get from the web component are directly managed or added by the managed object, and you get the theta, getter, the aggregations, the events, all these functions, all this stuff, the semantic sugar you get from UI5 control, you add by this web component base class. We have the metadata, which does some additional mapping stuff. So as mentioned, for example, this enable disabled stuff or the value state functionality, those things are added by the web component metadata. And we have the renderer, and the renderer is doing not so much more than just putting the web component into a wrapped structure of UI5 control into the DOM. And to show this one, we need, unfortunately, to switch the notebooks again. But we show you within the UI5 ecosystem, we have there one, I would say, larger app we used as a playground with a lot of controls. And this is actually a playground with a lot of mixed controls. You have in here standard UI5 controls, but you have also web component controls. And if you look, for example, already in the button section, you see this button buttons, and you see there is not so much a difference. So also because we had the questions before, what is the benefit of using M controls or web components instead of M controls if you have them already in there? So as Thorsten explained, you wouldn't directly benefit from it just by the look and feel. And that's also quite part of the goal. It shouldn't feel so different. It's in the end, I guess, mainly the benefit if you don't have this libraries already loaded. You can just load single web components and you have the smaller footprint. You don't have to load the whole huge M library, for example, and can just use it as you want to. And what Thorsten here already opened, that is this support tool, support dialog. Not sure if all of you know them, but here you can also see a bit the structure of such controls. Here we have the date range picker, for example. And if you see over here, we have this classical UI5 web components namespace. So that's the namespace we showed from the import statements and all things. So you have here directly the web component at hand. And what's the interesting thing is you have all the properties here. You could also play with these properties that will work. And it feels like UI5 control. And if you go the way down, you see this one is extended from the base type from another web component. So we have there's this inheritance chain. But if you also go further down, you will see we have here in the end, okay, date component base, it's still more extended. But then we have our base class, the base class I mentioned before, this web component base class. And from there on, you are in the UI5 world. You have down there the sap.ui control, and you have further below the element. And this is all like, it's in pure UI5 control. You won't feel any difference in the usage in the end anymore. And maybe, I'm not sure, we have, I guess, a minute. If you just...
Yeah, I can mention a couple of other things that we wanted to show. So as you can see, what Johannes explained, we have a full inheritance chain now that enables you to do instance of checks, for example, or is a checks. Just what you write down in TypeScript, you can also do at runtime. So if you need to know if a control inherits from something or if a specific interface is implemented that you find in TypeScript documentation, this is already available on the UI5 layer as a control. So you can have the full, let's call it inference that you can also use on the TypeScript level. You can use this at runtime too. And now maybe we have a quick look at the rendering part. So for that, I would open the debugger. Because we mentioned a couple of times that what you see in the DOM is the web component. And that's what we wanted to show you here, because the first thing I accidentally picked here is a panel. As you can see, it has a shadow root. That's not something that regular UI5 control has. So these shadow roots are only typically used for web components. And then again, coming back to what Peter showed you in the keynote, where he talked about theming and support for custom properties on the CSS level, when you change those properties, it will also change the web components because they are fully using the custom properties, as opposed to other UI5 controls that might still not be finished with that migration yet. But we're getting there. So as you can see, there's a UI5 panel. Another interesting thing is there's this suffix behind it that's automatically generated. That's also a feature that the web components provide. If you have web components in integration scenarios in different versions, they get a different suffix, so they don't have any version conflicts at runtime. So just to explain why there is this hash code at the very end. Yeah, and as you can see, there is a UI5 panel in here. If we, for example, pick this thing over here, and we extend this, go to this section, you can see there are a couple of div elements that are from UI5 Classic, but every time you have a regular web component, there's no special DOM wrapper or anything around this. This is just pure native web components, and everything in here is maintained by the web components. There's no control layer involved anymore, but if you, for example, do a little bit of jQuery magic and you retrieve the control instance to the currently selected element here, you see that this is now a UI5 control instance on which you can do things like get items. I think it's called items. And then you get an array with 3 class instances, which are then these avatars inside this thing. So, and if you expand the avatar group, you can see there are a couple of avatars in there. And yeah, this is how it looks in the rendering. So whatever you see in the DOM is just the same native stuff that you would write down as if you hadn't written it manually instead of using an XML view if you want to write HTML. There's other couple of samples in the sample application. You can find this app, as Johannes mentioned, in the ecosystem. it's just like a playground for us to try out different things. Up here, there are a couple test pages. The dynamic test page looks pretty cool, I think. This is essentially just taking the basic sample from the web components, porting it over to a UI5 XML view, and then it looks just like it did before, identical. But now inside you can use UI5 features like data binding. So the list in this case here is using a basic JSON model to just display stuff, and then the controls are cloned. Everything that UI5 offers is working just as intended, seamlessly, but the rendering technology underneath it is different. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say. Do you have something else?
You already took all the It's fine. Yes, just one thing I want to show. So, as mentioned, the ecosystem showcase, you can find it hopefully here soon. So we prepared an QR code where you can find all the stuff. When my slides are back again. Last time I need to switch. Yes. Right, that's the GitHub repository where you can find the ecosystem showcase, especially in this case the TS app WebC, so the showcase we showed. We have quite a few other, was a bit too fast. Maybe I go one slide back again. So that's the repository. We have a few more QR codes because there is additional stuff, especially if you are interested in creating your own web component. We have here the documentation. Ilhan and Naiden will have a talk, I guess, directly after our talk. 50, in 10 minutes. So feel free to join. They will explain a bit more in detail how this works. Creating own web components. Then there's also UI5 Live. Not sure if already every one of you is aware of the UI5 Live sessions, and there's one with Thorsten and Ilhan, I guess, where this topic is already mentioned and discussed a bit more in detail again. And then we are almost at the end. So the Outlook part. That's the question we questioned ourselves. What is our Outlook for today? And it's more or less the status quo. So we have now everything on the road, I would say, we had planned in the beginning. But for example, the TypeScript support is quite experimental. We released it last weekend, so it's really brand new, and we are really happy that we managed this to work because now that makes the, I would say, developer experience really, really great with the web components. And there is still, I would say, we know of a few bugs which are still in there, and it's also the reason why it's behind this skip switch for the moment, because we don't want to make it default right now, but we also wanted that you are able to use it, and especially that's our wish in our Outlook. Please use it and give us feedback, because all the things we now provided, I guess, make it easy to work with the web components, but to make it really great and to really get rid of the bugs or all the feature things you want to have for the future use, we would be happy to improve it and to implement it, and therefore just try it out and let us know if you find something and if you have some ideas how we can further improve these scenarios. So, and before we come to the questions, I maybe first, the remaining questions, I maybe first want to, mention the next connections you can have here. So we have a few follow-up talks. The one I already mentioned is the one from Ilhan and Naiden. There's also stuff related to accessibility with the web components. We have other things. Wouter has a talk about web components, I guess, later in the yellow room. And also our tables colleagues have a talk later and showing the new UI5 web components table. And in the end, we are also at the Export Corner session, so together with Ilhan and Naiden, and I guess also with Shahid and Duke, and are happy to answer questions you maybe have in the sessions. So, for that, I would say thank you, and any questions?
One question, this all works from 136
Yes.
version, or can I use it with earlier versions too?
It's not directly tied to the UI5 version, but you have to have the specific UI5 tooling modules version. Let me check which one that is. The latest one, so if you install the latest, that's what you can get.
I guess for the web component base class, at least you need to have 1.120, right?
I think 120, 1.120 is the earliest version where we have the base class support for the web components. But the current version of the UI5 tooling modules is 3.28. That's the one where you have the TypeScript support. Before that, you just get JavaScript support.
Thank you.
Hello, I have a question about custom UI5 web components. So if I would like to have types for these controls, is it enough to set the flag like this skip DTS generation as false, or do I need to, for now, do it manually by extending core web components class?
So there are essentially two ways. Either you write your own web component and then you write your own control class by extending from the base class. In this case, you write it directly in TypeScript. You don't need special support for it because you're writing it in TypeScript directly. The other one is, and that's something that probably Ilhan will show you in the next talk that we linked here, there is a tooling support for creating your own web component based on the UI5 ecosystem. And then there is other tools in place that will generate a metadata JSON. It's an open standard called custom elements metadata, and we rely on that to generate the control wrappers and the TypeScript files. So if you stick to that, you will get the TypeScript support out of the box. You don't have to specifically write this. You just need to implement your own web component. But of course, the better you write your types for your own web component, the better than the TypeScript support for the control wrapper will be.
Okay, thank you.
Will the web components replace the UI5M library in long-term future? And are there still any use cases where the M library will be better for new projects?
Okay, so this is it's kind of like a product management question, but I try to answer it in a way that is safe for me. But ideally, you post that question to Peter and Stefan. They can give you a better answer. I think they also have, maybe not now anymore, but they had this strategy session where they talked about this, or where you could ask them. I think you can just...
Maybe something for the late session later. Ask UI5 everything.
The basic idea is these web components, they essentially build the same stuff that you see in SAP.M, but they build it with a different rendering technology. And later, Shahid and Duk will also give a talk about the web components table, which again is, I don't want to call it a re-implementation. I'll leave it to their talk to decide this. But it is, again, the most modern rendering technology. So I would say you can expect down the line that web components will be the de facto standard. And there are web components that won't have a control directly, like the AI web components, for example. So as far as I know, there won't be any AI controls built specifically in any library. Maybe there will be a library wrapper or something, but the AI web components will be the only place where this is implemented. So if you want to use these features with some SAP AI technology, then you have to use web components there.
Is all of this also compatible with other web components or non-UI5 web components, or is there some kind of metadata magic behind them?
Partially. There is some metadata magic, because the UI5 web components, they give us some additional information that we can use, for example, to name aggregations better. If you look at the web components, basically they have, let's say, a default slot. Right? But how would you call that default slot in UI5? By convention, we call it content. Right? That's just the name that we have chosen, because default is, again, a keyword that we didn't want to reuse. But the UI5 web components, they have some additional metadata information on top of it, where they say, okay, in the avatar group, for example, we should call it items, because that's how we called it in the original web components library. So to stay consistent here, we have this additional information on top. But other web component packages that you use, as long as they stick to the open custom elements standard, you get the control wrapper. But the UI5 ones, they might be a bit better in the naming.
I I hope this isn't the same question, but so if you were to incorporate web components from another framework, you said you need some kind of control wrapper. And now I could just go ahead and create a custom UI5 control that just renders the web component. But if I understood you correctly, I should rather use the web components base class.
Yep.
But so other than being more clearly identifiable as a web component, what would be the benefits of that?
So the web component base class allows you to just define the tag that you want to use, right? And then you don't have to write your own renderer that renders this specific tag, and you don't necessarily have to take care of loading that web component. Ideally, you consume it via an NPM package. So you would, if you write your own web components or consume some other third-party library, you would have them as an NPM package that you can just then serve through the UI5 tooling modules, and everything is generated for you. You don't need to write any code. That's essentially the benefit. And to get the TypeScript support, of course, out of the box generated.
Thank you.
And just to mention, please feedback.